Good morning. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome you all to what will surely be a very interesting fireside chat. The topic we're covering today is the new world of Web 3.0, digital identity and NFTs. Cube Events is very, very excited to be part of this really interesting discussion. We are in the very capable hands of Chris Crespo, who is the head of content and co-founder of the Nordic FinTech magazine, who will shortly be introducing his guest. In the meantime, as you all log on, please, this is an interactive discussion, so we would love you all to participate. There's a question column on the right-hand side. So any questions or comments or chats that you'd like to have, please just post them in there, and we'd be very happy to answer the questions at the end. Thank you all so much for being here today. We're very, very excited about the subject matter here today, and I ask you all to interact. So thank you very much from the organizer side, and I hand it over to Chris. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Lily. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. My name is Chris Crespo. I'm founding partner and head of content at Nordic FinTech magazine. And it's such a pleasure to have you with us in this virtual fireside chat, where we will be talking about one of the most exciting technology trends to impact financial services in years. And of course, we're talking about Web3, NFTs, and the rise of digital identity. So if you've not about this or have heard about it and have only a vague notion of what these buzzwords refer to, then you've come to the right place, as today, to explain all of this, we're going to be speaking to Tyrone Lobban, head of blockchain launch at Onyx by JP Morgan. So with that, I would like to introduce Tyrone. Welcome to this fireside chat. Please tell us who you are and what it is that you do at Onyx.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much. And hi, everyone. Great to be here with you. So I run the blockchain and crypto team at JP Morgan. My team sits within a new business unit that JP Morgan actually recently created called Onyx. Onyx focuses exclusively on blockchain products, and essentially what we do is build new applications, new solutions, new infrastructures, really, not only for our clients, but also for industry at large. I've been in the blockchain space for about 6 years. I was one of the founding members of the blockchain program at JP Morgan. I also was the product lead for the Quorum platform that JP Morgan created, which is a fork of the public Ethereum blockchain. And I sit on the board of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. And really what I do is focus on this new technology and see how we can actually create new ways of doing business, essentially. So very much looking forward to the discussion today and everything around Web3.
That's wonderful, Tyrone. So let's start the conversation with Web3. Please talk to us about the shift from Web 2.0 to Web3, and what does this mean for consumers?
Yeah, well, actually, I think we can also go back to Web 1. So, if you remember the early days of the internet, and I still remember the very first time I went onto the internet, it actually happened to be in a library, which is, somewhat ironic and also poetic that surrounded by information, I went onto this new tool to actually go and explore what was happening in the world. And I think that's very, very analogous of, some of the disruptive elements that we're seeing today, where we're having these new technologies actually slowly permeate into our worlds and sort of be disruptive, without necessarily realizing it. But when you think back to those early days of the internet, what were we doing? We were going onto a browser and we were searching for some information, right? We were really passengers as part of this process, consuming the information. People refer to it as the read-only web. But it was great. I remember how excited I was about the fact that I could get this really janky web page in front of me. I knew at the time that it wasn't very great, but I could still get this information in a new way. And that was the internet, right? It was a very, very sort of primitive, one-dimensional experience right through most of the 90s, pretty much for about a decade. Of course, commerce started to come in, but it wasn't really until the early 2000s that we entered into this new Web 2.0 world. And Web 2.0 really was about being more participating in the internet itself, right? You could now go onto some platform, interact with your friends, buy goods and services in new ways. And that really became what we experienced for the last 15, 20 years or so. I think an interesting sort of analogy or an interesting example of how the shift actually happened even from Web 1 to Web 2 is, maybe during the early stages of the internet, I would have gone onto some music sites to learn about, you know, the newest album that was released by some artist, but I couldn't actually buy the album on that site, not for a long time in any case. What I could do is, you know, go to a physical CD store or record shop and then go and find that album and go and purchase it there. So there was actually this disconnect between the virtual digital world and what we did in the physical world. Web 2 started to actually bring those two things closer together. So now in Web 2, I could go online to some social media platform. I could learn about some new music from my friends, or, you know, maybe directly from the artists themselves. And then I could go to a streaming platform and I can actually stream the music directly. So I'm no longer having to go into the physical world to do the thing that I want to do. This is all now happening in the digital world. But a very important point here is that I, as the sort of consumer, when I'm streaming that music, I'm never owning that music, right? I'm actually sort of renting it from the platform that I'm using. And equally, the artists whose, you know, album I bought, they're getting quite limited upside from those sales. You know, streaming, you know, royalties from streaming are notoriously very low for the artists in the end. And so the platforms themselves that are actually offering us this new, you know, way of getting information and new way of getting goods and services, they're effectively the dominant player in the world of Web 2. And this brings us to Web 3. This is really where we start to see the change. If you think about this same example where I'm, you know, now looking to find my favorite artist's music, I'll probably do that in the same way. I'll go through, you know, a similar experience online. But now when I'm actually looking to buy an album or stream some music, I can actually do that directly from the artist. And I can do it in a way that I can, the artist gets, you know, a significant percentage of, you know, whatever that sales revenue is. But equally, I, as a consumer, end up owning the, you know, effectively the song itself. I don't want to say the rights to the song, but I own the song itself that I can go and, you know, sell to someone else or send to someone else. I'm essentially now moving from just being a passenger in the Web 1 world, a creator in the Web 2 world, but an owner in the Web 3 world. This is a very, very important shift that we're seeing from Web 3 in the new Web 3 landscape. And ultimately, what this is all actually enabled by is underlying open blockchain technology, right? This new infrastructure that we have available to us in blockchain is the thing that is actually creating this ability to own assets, because blockchains ultimately are a public ledger of ownership. They enable these assets to be moved freely between people and organizations, and are now enabling this new way of actually getting, you know, access to own these assets in a very different way to what we've experienced in Web 2. So that's roughly how I think about, and how I think generally people think about Web 1 versus 2 versus Web 3.
Okay, so I think that's a significant change from Web 2, where you're participating and creating content, especially when you move towards Web 3, when you're actually owning part of the infrastructure that is enabling that content. So, right, in line of this idea, can you tell us how digital identity play a role in Web 3, in the new evolution we're seeing of the web?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here. So, you know, there's not only just digital identity, but it's really the way that we use our identities to interact with Web 3. And I think that there are really sort of three dimensions to think about in terms of how consumers are interacting with this new world. One is the way that I interact with the service changes, right? So the traditional way of interacting with the internet is through a web browser. Now we have mobile apps on our phones. That's still going to be the case in Web 3, but we now have this additional access point, which are wallets, crypto wallets, right? These are the things that grant us the ability to interact with Web 3 applications. They're the things that actually hold these assets that we own, and they will also hold, you know, our digital identities that allow us to traverse these different ecosystems. So one is the way that I actually interact with Web 3. I think that's going to change. The second thing that, you know, Web 3 actually introduces is a different way of participation, right? No longer are we, as we've already discussed, sort of passengers or, you know, even just content creators, but I think we are actually part of communities. Community is a very, very big part of Web3. The things that I will do in Web3, the things that people are doing in Web3 are participating in governance, participating in roadmaps of platforms, how a platform actually gets developed. You can actually start to have direct control over the way that some of these newer products are actually being introduced. And I think another thing that is changing is the sort of mental shift around how I participate with the other side of a transaction. And by that, I mean, thinking back to this artist that I'm buying an album from, I'm now directly supporting someone. I can see where my money is going. I can see how that's impacting them. I can see what they are able to do in terms of creating their communities. And again, this is a very different notion from what we have in Web 2, where we're sort of behind a big corporate wall of, that's actually in front of us, and the people that we're buying these goods and services from, I now have a much more direct way of actually interacting with those people that I'm actually consuming goods from. And then that leads to, the final change, which is the value that I get. And this comes back to, ownership and participation. So like, not only do I get to own, the album that I bought, but I might actually get to own some of the platform that this album is being sold through, right? I'm now getting additional value from this entire experience. And more than that, we're seeing extremely innovative ways of, these content creators, for example, actually creating, experiences for us. So one example is there's a musical-based decentralized autonomous organization, a DAO, that basically allows artists to not only sell their music, but also allow the holders of that music to basically put a little note somewhere along the track. So when you're actually listening to this track, there's a visual element of the track as well. And you can see that, Tyrone actually was one of the original owners of this particular album. I mean, imagine the very first album released by the Beatles. If you could go back in time and see that, you were actually one of the original holders of that album, and there's like a little note to, your grandchildren of the future around the fact that you bought this album, that's pretty cool. I mean, this is not something that we can, really do today. So I think all of this is a change in the way that we as people are going to be interacting with services. And this is all underpinned by identity, right? It's all underpinned by the fact that we have new ways of representing ourselves, new ways of experiencing this ecosystem. And the technologies that are being created around digital identity are actually enabling this. There's this idea of verifiable credentials being created, which are provable points of who I am, that when I actually, buy some, or rather when I sell some item, that I am the authentic artist or the authentic creator. And obviously we're talking about, very much in the creator economy here, but this extends to finance, it extends to, industry at large. And I think ultimately this point of identity is actually going to be a very, very common thread and an important thread through all of these products that are being created.
Wow. Okay. So if I understand what you're saying correctly, it's that thanks to blockchain technology, we're being able to remove what has traditionally acted as a middleman, allowing people to interact directly with content creators and have some part ownership of the content that's being created.
Right.
Now, one of the roles that the intermediaries have traditionally held in interactions within Web 2.0 has been related to privacy and security. So, can you tell us, with all the concern that consumers have with relation to big tech and data privacy, how does privacy and anonymity change in Web 3?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important question and big topic. So when you think about Web 2, by default, you're actually giving up a lot of your information, right? This is the default. I'm gonna sign up to some service. I have to give a whole lot of information about myself, and we all know that we are the product, right? This is not a secret when we're actually interacting with traditional Web 2 services. Interestingly, by default in Web 3, you actually give up none of your information. You don't have to tell anyone who you are when you're interacting with some Web 3, DeFi application. Now, this will have to change over time from a regulatory perspective. but the base interaction is no private information revealed by default. So completely opposite to what we have in Web 2. The challenge, though, is that there is this sort of pseudonymous interaction with these public blockchains that become a problem for two reasons. The one is that when you think about the Web3 stack, so we have blockchains at the bottom, we have all of these sort of application layers above that, and this is, you know, NFT access, DeFi protocols, DAOs, et cetera, and then we have, you know, these web wallets or these crypto wallets above it. This is the way that we actually interact with these ecosystems. But the problem here that we start to run into from a privacy perspective is that they're all open, right? They're all public access. This is a fully auditable, traceable, trackable sort of stack that knows exactly what you have been doing in an anonymous or pseudonymous way. But, you know, over time, people will start to connect the dots, and already, you know, you're already leaving breadcrumbs about who you are. So privacy becomes actually a much more important topic in the world of Web3 because of these very open, trackable, publicly accessible platforms. I don't think that there are very strong solutions right now. I think there's a lot of work in play around how you can actually get to a more private interaction over blockchains. But, you know, again, coming back to one of the concepts that are being created today from an identity perspective is this idea of verifiable credentials. Verifiable credentials are effectively, you know, pieces of information that I own about myself that I can selectively reveal. You know, so instead of revealing by default everything about myself, I can selectively reveal to you parts of my identity. And then you can use those to, you know, verify whatever aspects you need about me in order for me to actually, you know, interact with your service. But there's more work that needs to be done around verifiable credentials. There's a lot of standards work that is underway at the moment. But I think what we're going to start to see over the next year or so is more embedding of these ideas of digital identity, verifiable credentials in this world of Web3.
All right, so I would like to now move on to addressing one of perhaps the hottest concepts that we are hearing about every single day in the media, wherever we turn, NFTs. So we've heard a lot of discussion around NFTs in relation to Web3. Can you please explain to us why they are important in Web3 and how do you think they will evolve from their current state as the Web3 services develop?
Yeah. Well, I think they're so important at the moment because they've brought a cultural aspect to blockchain, right? Blockchain, for people who are in the space, has for a long time been very finance oriented. You know, actually large financial institutions like ourselves got into blockchain because we saw the relevance of it to finance. And then we've had a lot of, you know, DeFi or decentralized finance applications and protocols being created. But for a lot of people, that is something that they're not necessarily interested in getting involved in their day-to-day. And so what NFTs has actually enabled is more of a mass appeal to what this technology can bring. I can now go and buy some really cool digital art, or I can go and buy some great photography and actually be the owner of that photography. Or I can go and buy some music and again, be the owner of that music. And we're starting to see some really cool ways that NFTs are enabling brands to actually interact with their consumer customers, right? Create new ways of, you know, enabling loyalty, new experiences to be established. This is something that prior to the NFT boom, we didn't have that sort of interaction with the general mass market that might be interested in more of a cultural side of things. So I think NFTs have been really, really important to enable more of a sort of, or lower the barriers to why blockchain is interesting or why this new world of Web3 is interesting at all. How this, I think, is going to evolve, though, is, you know, quite clearly NFTs are about owning unique items. And there are lots and lots of things in the world that are unique that don't necessarily have anything to do with media. So property rights, you know, the house that you own, the car that you bought, intellectual property, even coming back to financial services, you know, there are lots of financial products that if you could more easily transact through and exchange ownership of, that's going to have a huge impact in terms of the efficiency and the liquidity that can be brought to many of these financial markets. So I think we're almost at the, somewhat ironically, the Web 1 stage of Web 3 when it comes to NFTs, which is we're just taking some art and we're now representing that art in a new and slightly different way. But I think the ways that this is going to come about and the change that this is actually going to bring is, we're just at the start of that. So that's why I think, NFTs are super interesting right now. Also why I think that, the evolution is going to be much bigger than what we actually anticipate. But also we're kind of just at the beginning of it in any case.
Right. Okay. So then I guess, just going back to what you said earlier about Web3 being about ownership of the infrastructure and the networks, I guess NFTs will play a critical role in enabling people to part own those platforms that they're participating in.
Yeah, and this is really something that is the shift, is actually the crux of the shift from Web 2 to Web 3. It's the ownership of the platforms, right? It's the fact that now, in order to offer a service, as a service provider, I'm actually going to give away most of the ownership of that platform to the community, which is very different, obviously, from the large Web 2 behemoths of the world who own 95% plus of their platforms, the revenue from those platforms. It's an entire shift. It's completely turning the Web 2 model on its head, moving to more of a decentralized, community-led, community-driven model where, as a consumer, as a user of the service, I get to participate in the economic upside from day one of that platform. Unclear as to exactly how this is going to play out. This is a very different way of organizing people, right? So you've heard of this idea of DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. This is essentially a new legal structure for creating these platforms. But there's lots of inefficiencies in that, right? You can't have everyone voting on every single aspect of a product or the direction that a given organization or platform should go in. And so I think we're going to see somewhat of a hybrid model from how organizations and platforms are currently governed and managed, and the starting point for Web3. They'll sort of start to meet in the middle. But ultimately, the fact that as a user, I can actually participate in the ownership of that platform from day one immediately changes the way that these organizations are going to be managed and these products are going to be rolled out.
Right. All right. So before we go on, just a reminder to all our guests that you can ask questions on the chat. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the conversation. So if you have any burning questions that you want to ask Tyrone, just put them in the chat and we'll get to that eventually. So let's move on now to tokenization. Tell us, what are you thinking about asset tokenization in your world, in the world of Onyx and blockchain?
Yeah, so we actually launched a platform, as I mentioned, last year or back in 2020, called Onyx Digital Assets. And really what this is a generalized tokenization platform. It allows for institutions, corporates to represent different types of assets on blockchain, whether that be real estate or traditional securities and collateral, even things like NFTs. Being able to do that in essentially a bank grade regulated fashion with access to a large number of institutional players. So this is a high focus for us. We've launched our first application on this platform. We're in the process of rolling out a number of other applications as well. And I think the interesting thing here, when we think about the context of Web3, is that large financial institutions like JP Morgan and others can actually bring scale to DeFi and to Web3, right? Within the world of Web3 right now, you have incredibly innovative finance products that don't require banks, direct peer-to-peer lending or derivatives protocols that can be created. But ultimately, the liquidity in those markets is quite thin. It's quite small. And so what financial institutions like ourselves can bring is that institutional scale such that you can actually get a much more interesting, diverse set of assets in these protocols. And so when we think about tokenization of real world assets, whether that be US treasuries or real estate or otherwise, we think about how we can port some of those, some of that tokenization capability into the public blockchain realm, really pairing public blockchains with some of these more financial services oriented platforms like the Onyx digital assets platform, and ultimately just bringing those worlds a bit closer together. And I think what that's going to do is just create more innovation and more opportunity for these public ecosystems to actually leverage these newer assets that are now being created in platforms like ourselves. So lots of focus on tokenization. I think we think it's one of the key innovations that blockchain brings. Ultimately, everything we've spoken around ownership ultimately is through tokens, through tokenization. So we think this is very much part of the future trajectory.
Right. I think I speak for a lot of the audience here that these are just new concepts that it will take some time for us to get our head around what they actually are. But the question I have now is that in a recent Barron's Live interview with Umar Farouk, he mentioned that we are with crypto and blockchain where Napster was in relation to Spotify several years back. So in your opinion, where do you think all these things we're talking about are going?
Yeah, so well, Umar is my boss, so I'm sure he's right in terms of where we are. I think about two things here. One is, if you think about the past, 15, 20 years, the web has been about social media, right? That's been a very dominant theme that the internet and the World Wide Web has essentially created. I think we are going to be moving from social media to social money and social economies. And that is because we now have this ability to participate more directly. I often say, when we think back to the early stages of the web, what the web enabled was for anyone to get their voice heard, right? You can go and create a blog post and all of a sudden, a whole bunch of people could read what you had to say. What blockchain does is it allows anyone to create an economy. Anyone can create a token, create a platform, create a community around that platform, and ultimately create an economy. And that's what I think we're going to see. We're going to see a move from social media to social money. I also think that one of the key aspects of this is a real unbundling of existing products and services. If you think about the ability to take a very, very narrow slice of a problem, create a strong movement behind improving that service, and I'll use DeFi as an example. Banks offer a whole slew of services today. One of them happens to be lending. One of the very first forays into DeFi that these different DeFi protocols took on was lending. So you now have these protocols that are focused very narrowly on how to provide best rates, the best ability to borrow assets across any different type of asset class. And ultimately what that looks like is unbundling very slowly products and services offered by traditional financial institutions, but also other industries and corporate. So I think we'll see a mass unbundling and then a reconfiguration of those products into entirely different configurations that we have not necessarily seen today. So that's where I think we're going: social money, social economies, and mass unbundling.
It all sounds really exciting. Okay, well, just before we close, can you tell us how else can financial institutions like JP Morgan leverage the power and innovation of blockchains?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a financial services perspective, financial institutions are actually quite well placed to enable a lot of this, future that we've been speaking about. Coming back to identity, as an example, banks are, we do trust banks ultimately today with our money. We use them for our financial products and our financial lives. We also actually use them for our identity inadvertently, right? When you sign up to a bank, you go through a KYC process, and all of your information is vetted, and the bank holds that information for you. So I think that banks can be a strong anchor of your legal identity, in this new anonymous Web3 world when you do have to present things about yourself, your name, your address, or whatever the case is. So I think banks can be, the issuer of these credentials in some way. I also think that, coming back to what I was saying earlier, banks are in a strong position to enable more liquidity in this tokenization-based world, whether that be traditional assets and securities or helping to fractionalize, real estate through tokenization. There's a lot of sort of legacy know-how, and especially related to the regulatory and sort of legal aspects of that entire spectrum. Banks are very well positioned to do that. So I think we'll see more of that. That's certainly a focus area for us. And I think also exploring new areas that we're not currently in today, right? So I spoke about the fact that in Web3, the access points change. You need a crypto wallet to actually be able to dive into some Web3 protocol or participate in some DAO. I think financial institutions are, also pretty well placed there, and is something that we're exploring too.
Okay, and then just before we jump into questions from the audience, can you tell us how can we stay on top of these trends? Because they seem to be changing almost every week with new terms and new developments. How can we as consumers that are interested in this space can keep up on top of the trends?
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is I do this all day, every day, and I struggle to keep up. So, if anyone in the audience feels overwhelmed, it's completely normal. It is the rate of change and innovation is just unprecedented, I would say. I think there's two things. One, if you're the type of person who, learns by, reading and observing, there are lots of great research outlets out there, Masari, The Block, even some of the venture capitalist firms in the space, like A16Z, for example, put out a lot of great content. And there's a whole host of very Web3 focused, products, newsletters, etc., that you can also get your hands on. That's a great way of curating information and getting the sort of macro lens, but also diving into some very specific protocols and newer solutions. Of course, related to that is podcasts. There are a whole host of podcasts that, if for anyone who is commuting into work nowadays, not too sure how many people are doing that. But that's a great way of, just getting the latest information as well. But if you're more of a hands-on person, and I personally think this is the best way to try and immerse yourself in the space, go and download a crypto wallet. Install a crypto wallet on your phone or on your browser. Go and find some DeFi protocol. There's a whole host. If you go onto DeFi Pulse as an example, you can see the top DeFi protocols. Try and participate. Borrow some money, lend some money. Maybe find a DAO. Contribute to a DAO. I can't emphasize enough that Web3 is ultimately about community and ultimately about ownership. And the best way to experience that is to actually participate. It's incredible what is happening out there, and the rabbit hole goes very deep. And I think once you actually start to jump in, you really start to understand why this matters.
Tyrone, that's really, really good insights. So let's just jump onto some questions from the audience. I can see that we have some questions here in the chat. I'll start with the one at the very bottom. I think this is quite an interesting question. How is the value of an NFT determined?
Oh yeah, this is a great one. So there's going to be a number of different ways to think about this. One is when you're thinking about NFTs for media and art, it's no different actually to traditional art, right? It's sort of beauty is an eye of the beholder. How much do you like this piece of art? How much are you willing to pay for it? Ultimately, there's a market that's made by buyers and sellers coming to an agreement on what the value of something is. So that's one way to think about the value of an NFT. The other is that ultimately what NFTs are actually creating is, as I'd mentioned, a new way for engagement, a new way for brands to create loyalty, a new way to establish a common interest in something. And so what that ultimately looks like is status. If I hold this NFT, what is my status in this community? Access, what types of events or different experiences does this NFT actually allow me access to? If people haven't heard of this idea, many communities are using NFTs as a way of gating access to higher tiers or different types of products and services. So the value that an NFT has is also directly attributable to the types of engagement that the brand is sort of enabling for you through this NFT. And then in time, there's going to be a more traditional way of valuing NFTs. And by that, I mean financial products today are largely valued on their cash flows, like the future cash flows that something gives you ultimately leads to a present value of that particular asset. NFTs, I don't think are going to be very different in certain circumstances where the NFT is actually going to be your rights to some cash flow. You have a position in some financial products, and this is the way of proving that you actually are due, whatever that income is. And so there will be a traditional way of valuing those types of NFTs as well. And ultimately, all of this is going to be, as I had mentioned, reconfigured in entirely different ways, where you will have an index of some portfolio of NFT, art NFT products that will pay out, an income stream in other NFTs, and the derivatives upon derivatives is going to be, something that we're not really experiencing today, I think. So multiple ways of valuing NFTs, but it'll depend on what type of NFT you hold.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great question. We have another one here from Evi Sinios, and he's basically saying, how is JP Morgan able to help find the transition for customers from the centralized model that JP Morgan traditionally operates on to a decentralized model that is enabled by blockchain?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. One is, part of my team's job is to help our clients understand the space in a new way. So that looks like, working with them on product development, working with clients on strategy, even, educating clients on, the different aspects of Web3 and blockchain. And then the other is just in the products that we are creating as well, right? So, for example, through the Onyx digital asset platform that I mentioned, we are creating new ways to access liquidity. So for our clients, they can now get access to financing during the day in an entirely new way. And so actually participating in those products will help you understand, okay, what does it actually take to have blockchain infrastructure, accessible from my organization? Or what are the ways that I need to think about integrating this new technology? Even, what are some of the legal things that I should be thinking about and going through? So this is the learning by doing method, and I think participating in some of these products is certainly one way. And this is not just JP Morgan. Obviously, there's a whole host of different financial institutions and corporates who are very heavily involved in blockchain, and I think each of those are a valid way to try and get more into the space.
Okay, I think we have time perhaps for one last question. I'm going to go back here to the chat. There's a question from Michael Clark. I guess he's an ex-colleague at JP Morgan, and he's basically asking whether the use of NFTs are enabling JP Morgan to become or to have a view of becoming a custodian of data for customers. Is this a real option now that Web3 and web blockchain technologies are really becoming more mainstream?
Yeah, I think it's it has to be part of the conversation for the future, right? I mean, so again, banks are traditionally the custodians of your assets, but also your data, your information, and I think that they have a very real role to play in the future in the same way. I think that there will be additional ways that this data will be sort of managed in the future. We are already seeing, Web3 protocols being created that will allow you to store your social graph, as an example. That has very high privacy challenges, though. So I think we're going to see, a somewhat of a meeting of the traditional world and the new over time. But certainly from our perspective on the JP Morgan side, we're actively exploring what this can look like, right? What does this new world of identity require, and how can a bank like JP Morgan, with our trusted brand and our trusted infrastructure and our legal and regulatory obligations, how can we bring that level of trust to this new world, and specifically around identity, enable people to interact in this kind of newer way without necessarily having to reveal any of their information unnecessarily. So short answer is yes, but lots of work to do.
Well, that's fabulous. Tyrone, thank you so much for giving us a glimpse into this brave new world of NFTs and Web3 and digital identity. Just before we close, can you tell the audience where can they find more information about the work that Onyx is doing and about Web3 in general?
Yeah, if you want to learn more about Onyx, please go to jpmorgan.com/Onyx. We have a list of all of our products and capabilities that we are building on through there. And then for Web3, my number one recommendation is download a wallet and participate.
Fantastic. Well, Tyrone, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for all the insights that you shared with us this morning. I'm sure we've all appreciated it.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.